As my staff at Asper would tell you, I very seldom dressed up. Probably the only time I ever wore a service dress blue uniform was when I was going to the White House, and even there, most of the time I'd wear a woolly bully instead of the blouse with all the ribbons and all that jazz, you know, looking like a Mexican general. But so if you want to dress down, take your tie off, your jacket off, feel comfortable. We had a very good day yesterday. We're going to talk about that a little bit with our first panel. But I want to welcome you back. Again, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to attend, for the presenters for bringing their point of view, etc. Yesterday, I think one of the major comments I heard from people was, wow, this was really good because we had such a range of views that there was very little overlap in the way people discuss the issues. We'll talk a little bit in the first panel about what some of those issues were, but yesterday was a very good day, and I want to thank the panelists, the planning committee who brought those names to the table, brought those people to the table, Aaron, Karen, etc. Thank you so much. Staff, Lisa, Michelle, Emily, Claire, and Laura Runnels, thank you so much for all that you brought to help us get this done. Just a quick reminder, this workshop is to be more interactive. We saw that yesterday. We'll continue that. Speakers' bios are out front if you want them. Workshop proceedings in brief will be developed. Again, to remind you, we're not really setting up here to send a set of recommendations, but in fact, your comments become recommendations. So just remember that as you frame your comments. In effect, you're providing recommendations for coming forward. The workshop was designed to meet the following objectives, and you can be the judge of whether we're meeting those objectives or not. Ultimately, our client last night told me a positive, we are moving in the right direction, but you'll have to decide for yourself. So those objectives were explore the current evidence base on the causes and effects of medical product shortages, patient outcomes, their impact in disasters on patient outcomes, patient care, provider resource allocation and availability. We're to discuss the current efforts and innovative approaches to better predict, prevent, and respond to those medical product shortages that result from disasters or other public health emergencies. And one could say that, as we heard yesterday, the ongoing shortage crisis may be a public health emergency. It's just not declared as such. We need to examine the strategies that will ensure public health and healthcare providers can provide high-quality patient care during shortages of pharmaceuticals, medical devices, ancillary supplies, and I would also suggest certain kinds of medical or public health services. We didn't discuss that all that much yesterday, but in fact, that's part of that picture. And lastly, can we identify questions that have a researchable potential in ways that we could expand the evidence base to support the general public's understanding of this and to support policy making and decision making to improve patient care. So those are four big objectives, but I think that those are worthy objectives. And I know that our colleagues at the federal, state, and local level, in industry and in academia, all need to hear about this because any solutions that we bring forward will require a coherent effort that builds on a collective understanding and a consensus of priority that we're going to put to solving these problems. Maybe it's one piece at a time. Maybe it's two. But we have to come together to solve these issues, and hopefully the proceedings of this will provide a bit of a roadmap and some guidance for people to move that forward. That said, our first panel this morning is really designed to have a discussion of what a selected group of people observed yesterday. We couldn't invite everybody up here, but you're invited to make your comments as well as we move forward with the presentation. But we have four people who were here yesterday, observed. They'll comment on what they observed, and hopefully that sets us up then for the discussion as we go forward with the next set of panels on what are predictive solutions that we could develop, preventive solutions, and response solutions. So I'm going to ask the panelists to come up, and I will give you, so Linda, Aisha, Chris, Cheryl, if you would come up, please. I'll just give you a brief description of these folks as they come up. Linda Rouse O'Neill, you heard from yesterday. She was moderating a panel. She's the Vice President of Government Affairs at the Healthcare Industry Distributors Association. You've not met Aisha Lifebridge yet. She's an Associate Professor of Emergency Medicine and Health Policy at GW right next door here. And she's part of the ACEP group, the American College of Emergency Physicians. Cheryl Peterson-Krober is the Director of Emergency Preparedness and Response at the Minnesota Department of Health, one of my favorite groups. I've dealt with them a lot in the years past. And Christopher Hoff is here. He's the Assistant Director for Community Health Resources at DuPage County Health Department, the big city with broad shoulders out there on the prairie. And so we're going to have a little discussion here this morning of what did they get out of yesterday's presentations? What are the important effects that we might seek to prevent or mitigate, et cetera? So we'll engage and we'll have a little discussion here. All right. So why don't we start with you, Chris? What did you observe yesterday, and what do you think were the issues that really got focused yesterday that would lead us to thinking about how we can fix some of this stuff?
Sure, yeah, and as Admiral Vanderwagen said, I'm Chris Hoff. I'm with the DuPage County Health Department in Illinois. We're an organization of about 500 people serving about 1 million residents in suburban Chicago. So my perspective comes from that lens of being close to the ground with our communities, with our responders that are impacted by shortage situations and dealing directly with those patients and communities. So really my two kind of takeaways from yesterday were, one, the importance of working with coalitions locally to engage around this issue, both on the planning side in terms of understanding how this might impact their operations and being able to coordinate with them ahead of an event rather than at the time we identify that a shortage is imminent or taking place and trying to respond to that. Coalitions are often funded through HPP. They're a major deliverable through that. And what we deal with is often a lot of providers that don't have the resources that a large health system have to hire full-time shortage pharmacists, to have staff that's really able to look at those issues. So being able to work with our communities to plan for and respond for shortage situations, the coalition is really a great vehicle for that. So I will take away the importance of really engaging those folks, EMS, community providers, home health agencies, long-term care, all of these organizations that fit into our coalitions that don't necessarily have the same capabilities or resources as large health systems that we heard from yesterday. And the second area that I think was really critical that came up a few times was the idea of the ethical decision-making and the importance of crisis standards of care planning ahead of an event. And I think it's critical for us to acknowledge that there will be situations where we cannot meet the demand in a shortage situation. And it's imperative that we acknowledge that on the front end. Otherwise, our communities, our partners expect that we'll figure it out. And don't worry, because the health systems, the health care providers will solve this for us. And that cannot be the case. There will be situations that are extraordinary. The scenario yesterday, these are extraordinary circumstances. We have no way to fully prevent all of them. So really having a mechanism in which to engage community planners in that crisis standards of care, talk about what that will look like, how decisions will be made around rationing supplies, what communities can do, what healthcare providers can do during that situation, and have that be an ongoing process rather than at the time of the disaster trying to engage folks to say, you may not have the care that you expect to get because we're short on these resources. And that's really critical to do now and throughout in terms of responding to future shortage situations.
It sounds like you observed yesterday a series of presentations that were very helpful but focused more on the medical system per se. And so your observation about that was, well, we need to bring into that picture the fact that there are community assets that need to be brought to play as well.
Absolutely. Bring in and bring information down to those organizations that don't necessarily have the opportunity to participate at this level or aren't every day looking at the impact of their shortages. They're dealing with patient care one-on-one. They're dealing at the community level. And so really making sure that as local public health, we're bringing those providers in and making sure that there is resiliency built into that system so that when we have shortage situations, we've talked about it, we've planned for it, we've demonstrated that they're able to share resources or find alternatives.
Cheryl, and I'm just going to jump to you because I know that, Chris's perspective somewhat mirrors yours. What's your observation from yesterday, and are your observations similar to Chris's?
Many of my observations are.
Turn yourself on.
Many of my observations are similar to Chris's. I think the state perspective, we have a few different things that I noticed or saw or heard yesterday. One is that it is much more complex than I think any of us realize when you look at the players that we have here today. And what came to me was that we need to broaden the players who are here. We need to engage at the same level of partnerships that are in this room at the local and state level. I think we've got opportunities to engage state health departments in a greater way through the coalitions which we fund. So our role is kind of that coordination of those coalition efforts. I think that there are opportunities with the scarce resources that you mentioned, the crisis standards of care. I mentioned to the group earlier, we were very fortunate in Minnesota to have Dr. Hick on our staff. We funded him for a while, and he stayed with us. And the work that's happened with the scarce resource cards and looking at how do we deliver services, when you mentioned the service piece of this, we've talked mainly about medication. You look at things like ventilators. We had experiences in Minnesota where the private competitors were sharing things like ventilators during one of our severe flu seasons, not even during H1N1, and sharing PPE during Ebola. There's times when I think that if we didn't have these relationships for 10 years plus that have developed and trust has been put in place there, that those kinds of things wouldn't happen. The other role I see for state and local health in partnership is the use of the Empower data. And that, comes through ASPR, which is really important for us. But that gets into the, if we don't have electricity, the other pieces of service that are about shortage, not necessarily medication. So I think that's important. We really also have to, I believe, use the healthcare coalitions and our relationships with local public health to do that community engagement and to have the conversations during not crisis times with our communities at large. And it's the local public health agencies within your states that have that relationship. So if private sector, whether you're a manufacturer, a distributor, or a healthcare system, if you can have that relationship, be your trusted people on the ground and have those conversations before crisis, there will be greater trust in what messages we're delivering. So what I took away yesterday is we have lots of opportunities to do more, and that we can be a vehicle of communication. Public health as a whole and in its foundation looks at the whole community. And I believe that that's one of the things we've got to do with shortages of medication and services as we move forward.
Thanks. I'm gonna go to Aisha. Aisha, you sit at the front door of that hospital, interfacing with that community and those community assets. But what were your observations yesterday? Because you kind of have a foot in both of those worlds, the hospital world and the community world. What were your observations yesterday?
Absolutely. Well, first, thanks so much for having me. I am Asia Liferidge, and I'm an emergency physician, also a member of the Board of Directors for the American College of Emergency Physicians, or ACEP. And I actually practice right here in D.C. at George Washington University Hospital in the emergency department, where we have about 40 beds for patients. That's not including hallway beds. And we see about 80,000 patients annually. But that's the lens through which I kind of see things. And I'm also Associate Professor of Health Policy through the School of Public Health there at GW, so that's the other foot on the public health side of things. So on behalf of ACEP, or the American College of Emergency Physicians, and its 39,000 members worldwide, I want to first thank you all for the opportunity to share in this really timely and important discussion around drug shortages. Again, this is a really timely and relevant conversation. Being an emergency physician, we are at the very front door of all disasters. We tend to see them first, being on the front lines. And unfortunately, we're all too familiar with drug shortages, certainly in our everyday practice of taking care of patients. And it's really frustrating, actually, to know what to do, but not be able to do that to save lives even and take care of the critically ill and trauma patients as well. So there's no doubt that there's an ongoing and a persistent shortage of medications and supplies that we need, and it poses significant threats, really, to our ability to take care of patients and then to be able to respond in disasters. However, I'd argue that in our emergency departments, we deal with these shortages every single day. So not just in the face of a disaster, if you will, but we often find ourselves not having what we need to take care of patients. ACEP actually did a survey of all of our members and found that 9 out of 10 emergency physicians reported having had to deal with a drug shortage in the recent time that we're in now. And so it certainly is a real issue. And I would just challenge us to, when framing this discussion around disasters, think about how we define disasters. Because I can tell you there's a mini disaster every day in my emergency department. It just depends on how you want to define a disaster. Having patients in the waiting room in severe pain that we can't get back to the ED because there aren't enough beds is a disaster. Boarding psychiatric patients in the emergency department for days on end because, again, the inpatient capacity in terms of beds is lacking is no doubt a disaster. And certainly not having the life-saving medications that we need, whether it be injectable opioids or anti-nausea medications, IV medications for pain and the like, is disastrous, and I'd even argue embarrassing in these United States of America, and potentially really devastating in terms of patient outcomes. So while mostly we can predict the medications that we need in the emergency department, increasingly the supply of those medications is becoming more and more unpredictable. I can tell you a story now at GW, right down the street. The recent shortage is around morphine, so IV morphine, which is obviously a very common medication that we give for patients who are in distress and in pain, severe trauma cases, burns, and the like. And there's often a shortage of morphine in the emergency department right here in Washington, D.C., such that I've been forced to give IV Dilaudid instead of morphine for pain. So what's the issue with that? Why is that a big deal? Well, I'm being forced to give patients a medication that is different from morphine, that is significantly stronger in terms of its euphoric effects, that can then lead to higher addictive properties. And so on the one hand, you know, we've all kind of band together in a bipartisan way to end the opioid crisis. And then on the other hand, I again, every day am being forced to deliver a medication that in fact plays a major role in the opioid crisis. And so this actually speaks to what was discussed yesterday around this moral hazard that providers feel, this conflict and this sense of really helplessness in terms of, again, knowing what to do but not being able to do it. So providers have reported as well through ACEP that there are shortages. These shortages lead to delays in care and rationing abilities, difficulties in finding alternatives, increased costs, decreased time that we can spend with patients as we're trying to find the medications that we need to provide, and even hoarding and stockpiling medications so that when the time comes, there will be something available. The difference in the emergency department compared to other settings is that the difference between life and death and traumatic pain and relief really is a matter of seconds and minutes oftentimes. Patients cannot tolerate delays, and they shouldn't have to tolerate delays when it comes to emergencies. I'd even argue that starting somewhere is important. We mentioned how, you know, this is a vast, very complex issue, but starting somewhere is key. You know, there should never, ever be a shortage of normal saline, ever. There should never be a shortage of sodium bicarb. These are potentially life-saving medications, which are essentially salt water and baking soda and water. And then certainly medications like epinephrine, there should never be a lack of that. So if we can't be prepared on our every day-to-day needs in the emergency department, certainly we will fall short when we're faced with a disaster. So we spoke about coalitions, we talked about partnerships. I'm really proud to say that ACEP has partnered with other societies, and we worked really hard to push for strong efforts around solving this issue of drug shortages. And we're deeply encouraged by the FDA's recent announcement of the creation of a new drug shortages task force, and ACEP is really looking forward to being a part of that solution. So just overall, I just think there are, in terms of how to move forward and takeaways from yesterday, I'd just say that, one, I think that routine measurement in the way of inventory surveillance is key. So we need data, we need measurement, and we need it in a routine fashion. I also think that broadly applied transparency when it comes to manufacturers and distribution processes should be implemented to ensure that there's adequate competition, and that there was some discussion around how that may need to come through regulatory structure, looking at that piece. And then being flexible was also discussed on yesterday in terms of having the authority to adjust in real time when certain circumstances face us that need a different protocol than what may be on the books. And so having that official authority to be flexible, I think, is also really important. And then we talked about how there's so many stakeholders, right? And so outside of the emergency department, we often all kind of have our lens on and we're in our own kind of bubble. But this is excellent. The fact that there are so many stakeholders here, it certainly highlights the fact that this is a complex issue, but it also highlights the fact that we are willing and able to come together and discuss this really important topic. I think we have to figure out how to really align our incentives and to get out of our silos as well. So, figure out, what is your skin in the game? What is my skin in the game? And then with that information, figuring out how to align our incentives so that we ultimately can come up with cooperatives and initiatives that result in the quality patient care that patients deserve. And I'll just end by saying that, emergency physicians have operated under EMTALA from 1986, the law that actually mandates care to emergency patients regardless of their ability to pay, regardless of their access to insurance. We've been under that mandate for many years. But, it's hard to expect us to fulfill that mandate if we're not provided with the tools needed to do so effectively. And so that is the other kind of connection that I make with this drug shortage.
I think you highlighted a number of things we heard yesterday and added your voice to that shortage leads to changes in practice that could be good or bad. It could be a regression to a lesser quality of care, as you suggested. We heard all those things yesterday, and I think you highlighted those very nicely, so thanks for that. Linda, you really look at this at a broad perspective from a supply and sourcing perspective. What did you hear yesterday from folks?
Am I on? Come on. Yes? No? I hear yeses? Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here on the panel this morning, and I was really honored to be able to facilitate one of the panels yesterday. And in all honesty, I've rejiggered in my head after listening to my fellow panelists this morning like 5 times what I was going to say. So right now my mind kind of went blank when you asked what I heard yesterday. But I think I picked up on a couple same things, that everybody has a role, and communication. But I do feel like there is a lot of work to do around who communicates what and when and how, and who needs to know what information. And so I think that's something that HIDA as a trade association takes to heart as an association's role potentially, and then collaborating with other associations so that we are, and other coalitions and government entities that are interested, so that we can kind of collectively pull together the voices of our members on what would work and what wouldn't. A couple other things that I took away is, and we've kind of all touched on it, is there's so much. There's so many stakeholders, and how in the world would you ever get your mind around solving preparedness? And so what we've done, as an example, is we did pick a couple things. And we've been working with the Strategic National Stockpile. We've had conversations with Pat at BARDA, and we've been working with Laura's group, is pick a couple things to thoroughly understand. And needles is one of them, which was talked about yesterday by both Brad and Pat. And you can tell they talked, which which was great in that you had government folks listening to how is the commercial market working, what is in the commercial market, and how can you work better together. And I don't know if those conversations were as productive even 10 years ago. And I think that trust, I agree with you, and that relationship building is key to making some of that happen.
I wish our CEO from Needles R Us had talked to you.
CEO from Needles of Ours was wonderful yesterday. But I loved your role because what stuck with me is everybody in their role went back to what you would expect a politician to say, what you would expect a CEO to say, and not be that transparent right away. Where we've been talking all day yesterday about communications and transparency, but yet when you're in the situation, your knee-jerk reaction as a human being is to kind of protect yourself and your company and what you did. And yet we talked all day yesterday about changing standards of care, having to work on the fly with very little information, changing products. And while I think that's complicated, I honestly also felt heartened that we've got some great healthcare providers who are able to figure this out. You shouldn't have to, I agree, but the reality is with the supply chain, the way it's set up, is it happens that way sometimes. My folks are more on the device side, so I don't have as much insight into the drug shortage issues, although IV solutions go very much through the medical surgical supply chain, and we do that in high volume. But a couple of examples that from HIDA for our members, both distributors and our manufacturing partners, was especially after Ebola, with the recommendations that came out for all these protective equipment, which was necessary. But if anyone had picked up the phone and called the healthcare distribution system and said, hey, we're about to put out this recommendation for Tyvek suits, we would have said, well, that's great, but that's not our supply chain. That is a industrial protective suit. It is not used in everyday surgeries. None of our members had contracts with DuPont or whoever. But guess who all the hospitals were calling? They were calling their distributor saying, hey, I need 10,000 or whatever it was. I need all these Tyvek suits. We're like, well, okay. Everyone was trying to figure out the right person at DuPont to call. And we worked it all out because the supply chain is flexible but that communication didn't happen, where I think it would because of the relationships that we built, and I think because of that recognition. But because of that, we've been sitting down with some folks from SNS and BARDA and the Critical Infrastructure Program, and we picked a couple, needles, and walked through, and it was wonderful. Brad did a great job. We had his competitors in that room and a distributor walking through. What needles do you need? Because we didn't even speak the same language. What types of needles? Well, we call them something different in the commercial market. Or, guess what? We sold off that part of our business, and now it's owned by X. And we all know there's a lot of consolidation and buying and selling of each other's departments and manufacturing product portfolios in the commercial market. Once we then spoke the same language, we were able to agree on the attributes of those needles that would make sense. And then we were able to and get that validated by the science team at the SNS. And then we were able to build out from there, give them a commercial market snapshot of what's in the market that meets those attributes. So it wasn't just one manufacturer. But that took, what, Brad, a year to walk through? It was a lot of conversations, a lot of going back and forth, and that's wonderful. And we also started to look at gloves, which created a whole different set of circumstances because they're basically all made in Asia. And so there was a different set of issues that were in discussion. But we walked through where are they all coming from, where they're all made, how they're distributed, who's distributing what, and the types that are used in the different markets. You wouldn't necessarily use a vinyl glove in the emergency room, but the post-acute nursing home folks use vinyl gloves a lot. And understanding the differences even in the glove market, which was eye-opening for me. Who knew there was that many different types of gloves?
That supports some of what Mike brought to us yesterday about masks.
Yep.
And the notion that having somebody ramp up to produce XYZ product for one buy isn't a sustainable practice necessarily, where we've offshored a lot of it, and to just, in the nature of an event, try to bring up something locally to get it done isn't a sustainable solution, as we heard from him yesterday. And you're sort of heading in that same direction.
It was a great example. I loved having Mike on my panel because I feel like we had great providers, but you also had that commercial market from a business perspective, or even anybody in the right, you're going to hire 150 people to fill an order, and then that demand goes away. And that's where the supply chain really struggles. really understanding that true demand. Are people hoarding? Are they over-ordering because they're panicked? Are they ordering from multiple different distributors, not just their primary distributor? So how much do the manufacturers need to ramp up? And then what happens to all that product when, let's be honest, everyone's on tight budgets and resources, and you're like, no, I don't need that right now. Okay, well, it took us 5 years to get rid of all the masks from H1N1 that we had. Distributors then take ownership. If we purchase it from the manufacturer, we're stuck with it because they don't want it back at that point. So, I mean, I'm hoping, you know, as we talk through today on solutions from a supply chain perspective, what is the solution? How can you ramp up in a way that has more stuff? We have moved to a very lean and mean system for a lot of different reasons. But it doesn't help during a crisis because there's not enough sitting there in emergency stock and elsewhere. Manufacturers are mostly at capacity. There's not lines and facilities just sitting there empty waiting to get, you know, turned on to make more. It just doesn't work that way. So what is the answer? You know, how do you create a little bit more of a constant elevated demand so that you have more and you aren't having stuff just sit and then expire and then sit and then expire? And that's what I'm hoping folks kind of talk about.
I just have a comment to make on that. It brought back a memory of H1N1, and the conversation about having those partners engaged throughout the planning process is critically important. When those masks came out during H1N1 and we were flooded with supply, it was fantastic on one hand to have access to that material and to have PPE that was effective against that particular threat. However, we were flooded with products that didn't necessarily match up with the needs of the providers. And we hadn't really engaged with them about, well, what product do you actually use? What are you fit tested to use? What are you capable of taking into your supply chain? And it definitely is the second piece of, I think Brad made the comment yesterday, like, or maybe the mask manufacturer about, well, you're lucky to get what you get and, you know, you should be able to adapt those practices. The reality is switching over to a different product does have huge implications. So it behooves us to have those conversations early about what are some of those key things, the key products, if we're talking masks and needles, really understand from the federal kind of purchasing level and coordination with manufacturers all the way down to the individual provider, what is most frequently used, what are we capable of absorbing, and what's going to have as minimal of impact as possible during a disaster. And we're already stressed on responding to the issue, then going through the administrative and logistical change of absorbing a new product is a whole nother issue to add on top of that response.
You all have talked about observations of yesterday that communication was a real issue. Aisha, what do you think are the obstructions that inhibit us in doing the kind of communication we might be able to do?
Sure. So again, I think that we find ourselves within silos, and I think we have to be really intentional and strategic about coming out of those silos and understanding that the chain is weaker if we're missing links. And so I think that it's really, to some degree, a cultural issue where we're used to kind of doing our own thing and not discussing. We were talking earlier before we got together on the panel about how, especially in the medical world, it's like we have this issue, we're working on it, and then finally when it's really a disaster, when it's really a mess, we're like, well, where's the Department of Health? Where are they? You know, and so waiting until it gets to proportions that are not manageable just doesn't make sense. It's almost like we need to have standing coalitions that are multi-stakeholder, meet and convene on a regular basis just to kind of check in, almost like marriage counseling, to see how things are going. And so yeah, I would say that one of the obstacles is just getting out of the mindset that we've been so used to for years.
Does that resonate to anybody else here?
Yeah, I'll comment on that. I think the communication is critical, and I think if we can figure out how to maximize the healthcare coalitions, when you look at that, the whole community is involved. And then the step beyond that is you have the players who are there in the room. How do they bring it back to their organizations and institutions and own the responsibility? How do we empower them to own the responsibility to bring that message back? So if you have somebody from George Washington Hospital who sits on the local coalition and attends the meetings and hears all this information and learns things, how do they bring it back then so that your whole system hears about it? And I think that's the challenge, because we're in silos within our organizations and then silos within our organization. So I think that's a real big problem for all of us. And I think, again, in times of crisis, like you said, people do look to the health department, whether it's the local or the state. And I thought of what the governor said yesterday about the fact that, you know, you would have authority to take things from places. Well, of course, Minnesota has the same authority, but there's also language that says we have the authority as long as it's not essential to the facility at the time. Well, if we're at a point where we're looking at taking something from someone, it's going to be essential for them to have it themselves. So I think we have to look at, is the legislation true to its intent, or is it written so that it, you know, makes everybody happy, and then it really becomes less meaningful. So I think there's much we have to talk about.
But I've heard your observations here. I've heard a couple of things that I heard yesterday, and that is that those entities that have really thought about this and are prepared. We heard that from AmerisourceBergen yesterday, for instance, their continuity of business and their thought process about what do they need to be thinking forward about. A very nice example of that. We heard that from a few hospital folks. I had the experience with Harvey with a hospital system that was a great hospital system. They had a great coalition, but they had sent one minor staff person to attend the coalition meetings and really didn't know what that coalition could do or had to offer. Or other stories where CEOs would go just to kind of fend people off so that the coalitions were not being exploited effectively by enhancing the kind of communication you talked about and having that marriage counselor stuff going on a regular basis. So we heard some of that yesterday, that those that have taken an active preparedness posture seem to have a much better approach to how they're going to deal with this. They understand that they could exploit crisis standards of care as a tool to think about how they're going to manage dealing with this regressive decline in quality of service, et cetera. You guys have made some observations that I thought I heard yesterday as well, that it's an enterprise sort of solution that needs to be developed. It can't be single players. We heard that from folks. ISPE talked about that in terms of corporate culture shift, et cetera. Federal surveillance and data systems, the tracking of inventory in a local environment, but then a larger data system looking at what does the big picture look like, and how does that inform us in anticipating what we need to do. We heard those kind of discussions in the first panel right up front. We have American Society of Hospital Pharmacists, you know, their database, FDA's got a database, what do they tell us? Is it adequate? We heard those discussions. You talked about your observation, and we heard that yesterday. Drug shortages lead to use of unfamiliar products or products that you really wouldn't want to use if you didn't have to, and that can lead to potential medical errors and other side effects. We heard that yesterday. We heard policies are important. Yeah, it's great for us here in Washington bloviating about policy, et cetera, but the bottom line is the local application, what you have to deal with in the ER, what the community has to think about in terms of mask fitting and this and that and the other thing, that local application anticipatory training is critically important. And when you think about your policy, you have to think that what are the downstream impacts that are going to happen, because we heard some reports yesterday, policies lead to this, but geez, you know, at the ground we were going, what that's all about. So, you know, I think you've reflected a lot of some of the things we heard from your own perspectives, and it's very helpful, I think, to be thinking about that. I'm hearing that communication is a critical component of this, that a sense of community engagement was, we heard that from people yesterday, we're hearing that from you all today. So I think we're kind of set up now for where are we going to go with some of these solutions. I mean, these are the issues, so what will we do? I'm going to invite a few others of you to step forward. We've got a few minutes here, and if there are other observations of what you saw or heard yesterday that you think is a focal point that our following panels need to be thinking about as they talk about their solution sets, bring them forward. So, Len.
Thank you, Craig. My name is Len Singer. I'm a retired surgeon. I went to the dark side. I'm with an outfit now called Clinical Consequence Strategies. Our most recent gig was in Puerto Rico from about 2 weeks following landfall of Maria. By the way, remember there were 2 hurricanes. The first one wiped out 1/3 of the electrical power for the entire island. Maria, about 2 weeks afterwards, till about 8 weeks afterwards, and during that time we interviewed the major CEOs of all the major hospitals on the island. And we came up with a bunch of recommendations, but before I start with that, I'd like to just touch on a couple of points, and I hope you'll bear with me. And it's a plea for clarity of language. And by the way, Craig, you've been around for a long time, as I have, and so we've heard this discussion many, many times in the past. We have to be careful about how we use our terms. A disaster is not an emergency, and it's not a crisis, and it's not a catastrophic event. They're each different, and if we use them interchangeably, we are at risk of basically losing the message. Yes, I'm sorry, the emergency room at GW on a Saturday night is a disaster locally, but it doesn't impact Washington, D.C., and it certainly doesn't impact this region or the country unless it becomes a full-fledged disaster. So I think we have to use those terms carefully, and even the subject matter. If we look at the topic, I'm not sure what that means, frankly. Is this a medical product shortage in a disaster? Does that mean the shortages that were sustained during the disaster in Puerto Rico? Or is it the secondary disasters, perhaps, or secondary shortages sustained here on the mainland because of the failure of those plants? So let's get our act together with terminology. It's important. And as another point to that, I would urge us to kind of avoid the word rationing. It's a triggering word. You know, I don't usually use that terminology, but it definitely triggers genetic memories of food cards and long lines. And yes, we all do rational distribution of limited assets. And we do it every day. And we do it in disaster and we do it in emergency. But rationing is a word I think to avoid because it cues up a lot of bad memories. I would also make the point that, you know, yesterday we heard all about medical product shortages, and there was basically it split it into parenteral and non-parenteral. I think that's a valuable distinction. I would also say that it probably is useful to talk about products that are sensitive to to temperature. The cold chain in particular is a different perspective and a different challenge, and one of the problems we saw in Puerto Rico early on were insulin-dependent patients who simply could not get their product because of a lack of electricity. So that's a separate issue. I do want to kind of piggyback on Dr. Leifrich's comments about an enhanced coalition. One of the things we experienced was a number of these major hospitals reached out to their communities. Remember, communication was gone. Transportation was gone, unless you happen to have easy access to a helicopter. There was no fuel. And I'm talking about the hospitals. I'm not talking about individuals. So if you're a diabetic sitting in your village, which is 15 miles away from the major hospital, the roads are gone. You don't have a telephone because there's no communication. Oh, and by the way, as a sideline, just be aware that for 6 to 8 weeks, a number of these major hospitals had no access to their ISP, which means the cloud, there is no cloud for them, which means the records, which were on EHR, exclusively on the cloud, were gone. In fact, I will say something that if you're from CMS, I'm sorry, I apologize in advance. Uniformly, every single CEO of these major hospitals said to us, thank God we had not fully implemented the EHR and we still had paper records. I know that's going to upset some people. So The strategy of enhanced coalitions, I think, is a fascinating one, because what we found was a number of the hospitals reached out to their neighboring other medical care providers, not related to them, dialysis centers that had closed. Uniformly, with private industry, when the power is out, they were gone. Okay, so all these dialysis centers were closed. The hospitals themselves had very little capacity, and some of the hospitals were very creative. They actually broke into these lockdown dialysis centers and basically brought them back up to steam so that they could service their population. Hospitals were helping out local hospitals, and that was actually a function of coalitions. Yes, they were coalitions that were, for the most part, created for HPP granting, but they extended themselves, and our concept was that we'd like to formalize that process and actually use that as a center for assistance for public health. Most of the public health in Puerto Rico is based in San Juan. It's not based in the periphery of the island. And to actually stockpile products and beds so that in the event of a disaster of this nature, they could respond. You may be thinking to yourselves, well, Puerto Rico, it's an island and it's primitive, and you know, we're in the States. We can always get resources from elsewhere. And I urge you to think about the scenario of an earthquake. We will not be able to get around. There will be no power. There will be no fuel. And so this is kind of a wake-up call for all of us.
Len, what you point out is what most of us who deployed into these events understand, and that is that we return to the 19th century pretty quickly. And so your strategic thinking about what your tactical opportunities are become limited by the fact that you're now living in the 19th century. And the reality of the 19th century is that the strength of response to anything was built around communal capacity to come together and find resiliency within themselves, ad hoc or based on formal relationships, and extending those to address that reality. And you're absolutely right. And these after-action kinds of reflections of what was that event and what did it teach us, I think are very helpful to us in thinking about how that impacts shortages in the environment. Cold chain issues where you have no power become real issues. That shortage is caused by a disaster itself, which is a different thing than the background disaster. We need to be conscious and aware of that. That was part of what the skit, if you will, was about yesterday. But I think these are very valuable reflections for us to be thinking about as we think about the shortages within a disaster, catastrophic event. I mean, we can parse that a variety of different ways depending upon the scope of it. And I think you're right. It has to be understood in a fairly structured way. And those are very helpful reflections.
One comment on the communications piece, when you're talking about common terminology. Well, this isn't exact, but one thing that we've been thinking about, we're doing a summit at the end of our annual meeting in September, and it's around some device shortages, obviously, since we're the device manufacturers and distributors, but is when there are shortages, how are we communicating with each other as a supply chain? So the commercial market's obviously got a role in being able to communicate better between manufacturers and distributors, and then how are we communicating with our customers so that the hospitals and the physicians that we serve and the nursing homes have the information that they need when they need it? And are we communicating? And there might be different triggers on when. Is it a 3-day hiccup because there's the hurricane, in Hawaii, and things coming from Asia just, have to take a little bit of a longer route to get across the Pacific? Or is it something more catastrophic or longer lasting? And how would we work on those standards of communicating, as well as how would we communicate with the government? When would we need to? How can they help? And so we've got government panel, commercial panel. But our goal is to kind of maybe come up with, don't hold me to this because I want the conversation to unfold in a few weeks, but is there a role for HIDA as the association to pull together some best practices around that communicating for different types of shortages? And I know the hospital pharmacists are doing they're doing a meeting very similar to ours, except on pharma the week before, which I'm going to go to, and our goal is to chat with each other afterwards. Is there some overlap for drugs and devices that might make sense to have some supply chain recommendations around, while there's a lot of uniqueness and diversity in both of those? So I do think there's some effort to, maybe not standard terminology, but standard ways of communicating or some key information so that we can start doing a better job around that. And then our customers are going to be able to have a much better sense of what's going on.
As our solution panels unfold today, they may help us to understand how do we get common understanding so we know the problem we're focusing on is the same problem.
Right.
I was going to say, and don't forget then the associations like ASTO, because you get they have the reach to the all of me's, and I have the reach to the all of the Chris's. So I think that's, you know, a way that we can also extend the capacity for communication.
Amy, is that you?
Amy Kircher, University of Minnesota. So, you know, as I'm looking through my 15 pages of notes from yesterday, I'm trying to, as a systems person, put them in buckets. There are all kinds of issues we've highlighted. They're in, you know, from raw materials all the way to delivery of care. And so I was trying to compartmentalize where, you know, who should tackle what problem. All of us have plenty of work to do, so we have a little bit of job security, I think, in working on this for several years. But I don't want to, and I don't think I'm playing by your rules, so I apologize for that up front. My question, I don't want to miss the opportunity where we have operators on the stage who are rubber meets the road and you guys are, you know, practicing. So if I were to give you $10 million, what is the one thing that you want, what's your priority fix? I mean, with all of these things that we need to work on, where are we missing? What would make your life better? 100 million, it could be 5 million, 100 million. I mean, I think sometimes we're paralyzed that we need 100 million to fix everything. We need 100 million or 1 billion to fix everything. But, you know, some of these, like, I have to say, I can't believe we haven't fixed credentialing yet. Really? I mean, all my years in the government, I'm like, we've worked on that every year, so I'll put that to the side. But, you know, not all of these fixes are 100 million or 2 billion or whatever. Some of them are easier. So for whatever your problem is, I have the money for you. What do you need fixed first?
Oh, thanks, Amy. That's not an easy question. I guess. Yeah. I think from my perspective, being, you know, representing states and ASTO, it's really about finding the opportunities, and I don't know if it's some kind of a new conference. There's conferences all over, so I don't know how we find a way to make sure everybody's talking to each other. You know, it goes to what you said about everybody's busy. I don't know if we have to come up with some kind of a new person whose sole responsibility is, you know, keeping a pulse on everything and then having a formal mechanism for reporting it back. Because I think that's what happens is we send people, they come with information. You have 12 pages of notes, so does everybody else probably in the room. And how do we help get that message then to all of the people we interface with on a day-to-day basis?
So you'd invest your $10 million in trying to find a way to enhance communication.
Correct, I would.
So I'll take a stab at the question, Amy. I think that one of the things that I heard a lot yesterday, again, was we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what we don't know. And so with my $10 million, thank you very much, I would focus on measures. I would focus on data. I would focus on better understanding on a day-to-day basis what we have and what we don't have. I think we have to start there, and I think there's a huge opportunity there and lack of resources that are going into measure development. Right now, we're in an age of quality metrics in medicine, right? So CMS is pushing quality metrics, linking the care that we provide to quality, and also linking it to payment in terms of provider compensation and the like. And so we're already kind of in that realm of it being a bit of a sexy thing to have quality metrics and metrics. And so why not link adequate inventory to quality? Why not take advantage of the mindset that we currently are in through CMS, HHS, and the like to focus on inventory adequacy as a measure and making that a broadly applied mandate?
So you would argue that information informing these kind of communications is a critical piece that you think needs investing.
Absolutely. Information.
Quality, but it informs the dialogue.
Information, and I don't think you can use the word information without adding the word transparency, because, you know, without the information, we just don't know what we don't know.
Okay, well, Mike, you may get the last word here because I'm cutting into Nav and her panel, so we're going to have to quit. But Mike, you get the last word.
I'll be very quick. I'm Michael Bowen, and I'm the spokesperson for the Secure Mask Supply Association. I'm also one of the owners of Prestige Ameritech, America's largest surgical mask company. Several people, including one on the panel, I can't remember who, said something like, well, we don't have empty manufacturing lines or idle manufacturing lines just sitting around. With all the people in this room, I wanted to say that actually that's not true with masks. There was a company, I'm sure most of you are familiar with Safe Skin gloves. When Safe Skin sold to Kimberly-Clark, the CEO started a company called Safe Life. They went into the respirator business, raised a lot of money, built a lot of equipment, didn't work out, and I bought the assets. I have 4 complete N95 manufacturing lines that somebody should know about. I essentially have a warm-based operation in Texas, literally collecting dust, a room about from here to there, full of these machines, and I have no customers for them. It's the mask that's actually on the TV show Chicago Med. If you ever watch that show, it's that blue mask. Anyway, so there's 4 manufacturing lines that could be brought to bear in an emergency, and I just say that because several people have made that comment that that's not, you know, there aren't these manufacturing lines. Well, there are, and somebody in here will need those machines or knows somebody who will, so I just wanted to let everybody know.
Yeah, I would paraphrase what you just said, Mike, to something we heard yesterday, and it goes to the point just made by Aisha as well, and that is full and transparent information about what the situation really is. It's a situational awareness question. If we don't understand what the manufacturing capacity is, then we can't plan effectively as to what our options and alternatives are in response. And so I'm going to paraphrase, and what we heard yesterday and what you just said is data clarity and an analysis of gaps in that data is important for us to think about. Well, thank you all for bearing with me. And Len, I'm sorry if I cut you short a little bit. I think that was, you brought a very nice presentation discussion to that. But our time is up. I want to thank this group for being here this morning. Thank you for your questions.